Hi, this is Alex Shearer. I'd like to welcome you to this week's take on in development. Obviously, trying something a little bit different this week. We're returning to Manabase worksheets, and it turns out the updated worksheet for modern is kind of complicated. And it's complex enough that I thought it was easier for everyone if we go through it in a video format. So today's in development is going to be about using the modern Manabase worksheet, how you put stuff into it, what you can get out of it, things like that. So we're going to get into that in a moment, and I've split this into 3 parts to make it easier to go through. But before we go into that, I wanted to check in for a little bit about the entire idea of using this kind of model. Anytime we model anything, we're making assumptions. We make simplifications. The whole basic point is just to give us guidelines for what we want to do. And if I were in physics, I would probably want something that would predict down to very, very, very small decimal places the reality I'm trying to model. But I don't come to it from that background, and I think playing Magic, you don't want to come to it from that background either. Instead, I come from the bio background where we sort of go for good enough, the thing that will let us run the test, or in the case of putting a deck together, the thing that will let us get to the play test level, or let us have something that's not going to just completely crap out on us at a tournament. So this page of equation-y gibberish that I'm showing you right now, this is all about enzyme kinetics, and if you've had a biochemistry class, an intro bio class, you probably run into this. It's a pretty well-known equation that we come to eventually from all this called Michaelis-Menten kinetics. And the basic point is that you see these 1, 2, 3, there are these complicated interactions. Here's enzyme kinetics. You have these 2 things that come together, and there's a forward reaction, there's a back reaction, and there's stuff being siphoned off that way. And it turns out that if you actually do the math for this, it's somewhere between intensely difficult and just impossible to resolve for many cases. But you get to make assumptions. And so you get to make simplifying assumptions like, I think that probably this stuff here is all just getting drawn out. I'm making some product and then it gets used for something else. So effectively it's not there. And if it's not there, then instead of having this equation here, I actually get to drop out that K2 and get this instead, and suddenly the math becomes easier. I'm not really going to try to teach anyone any more enzyme kinetics right now, but the basic point is, in terms of absolute accuracy, we introduced an error. We dropped out detail. But in terms of giving us information we can actually use, we now actually have information we can use, and we didn't have that before. And the same thing applies to any time we put together some tool for modeling stuff in Magic. Like all the Manabase worksheets make certain assumptions. They make assumptions about keepable hands. When you say, oh, well, I'm going to have this many hands on average that have the color white being produced by them. That's great. But are they also going to have creatures you can use? Well, I don't know. I'd have to model your whole deck and your cognitive process and your matchups to see. For example, I write about Dredge every so often in Legacy, and a keepable hand on the play and a keepable hand on the draw can be very different things. Like, I'm not playing Monolith Dredge, but I don't have to have mana if I'm on the draw, as long as I have a good dredger. It may not be a good idea, but against countertop, it might be. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that we're making approximations, and the whole point is just to give us guidelines to let us think about what lands we want to use in this fairly complicated format. Okay, with that in mind, let's take a look at the actual worksheet the way it looks right now. And okay, here we go. This is the current version of the modern Manabase worksheet, and oh my god, isn't it horrifying. Okay, so I wanted to show you the whole thing because one of the big points here is you don't need to pay attention to the vast majority of this. It turns out that trying to connect things like Ravnica dual lands with Zendikar fetches and so on and so forth, that takes a bit of monkeying around in the spreadsheet. And I have tried to label this so that it's pretty clear that you, the user, need to care about these things up to about this column M here, and everything else is grayed out. Now don't modify any of this stuff, it will break the spreadsheet, but this is not user material, this is back-end material. This is the calculations being done that are going to give you the information that you need out at the end. So obviously, if you're a tinkerer, if you want to try to figure out, reverse engineer what I've done here, it's all right there. But basically, everything to the right of M, you can ignore. You don't need it. And really, most things other than the yellow numbers column, you don't need. So with that in mind, let's take a moment, zoom in a little bit, so we can ignore the rest of this stuff. Okay, so now we're looking at the stuff that matters. So pretty straightforward. We have lands down the left side, number, the yellow column, that's where you put in the number of lands of that land that you have. Then some information. We have the colors provided by that land, the types it has, if any. That little finds column is about fetches and what they find. Then you have these toggles. ETBT, does it enter the battlefield tapped? Is it a creature? Is it a fetch land? Is it a shock land? Is it a snow land? Is it a fast duel, and that's what I call the Scars dual lands? Is it a pain land? And then this untapped in 10 cards thing, which you'll be familiar with if you saw my earlier mana-based worksheets. And that's going to be looking at what the buddy lands, which I had to be reminded was my own term for them, how often they come in untapped or not. So on the land side here, I've included the big hits of the Modern format. The worksheet explicitly does not include every possible land in Modern. There's space at the bottom, which I'm going to show you in just a little bit, where you can add in additional lands if you, for some godforsaken reason, for example, are using the Kamigawa dual lands, or if you're running a snow deck and you're using the Cold Snap snow duels, etc., etc. You'll also notice that not all of these toggles serve any immediate purpose. For example, I'll move the cursor here, noting that stuff is snow or not. I don't run any calculations on snow landiness. I don't have a scred calculator yet, but I figured it's a major trait and it would be the kind of thing that I might care about later, that one of you might want to engineer in some math based on it. So I've noted these things. Some of the other things, like whether or not it's a shock land, whether or not it's a pain land, that's all covered. That actually does factor into calculations down below. So looking at the lands that we have already baked into the worksheet, we have the basics and their snow iterations. Note they're alphabetized within each group. We have the shock lands, that's the Ravnica duels, and so you can see the colors provided by each one, black-red, blue-green, and the types. Blood Crypt is a mountain swamp, for example, and it's a shock land. We have, the next category is what I call other typed lands, which is a somewhat obscure sounding name, but it basically means what it says. These are other lands that happen to have a basic land type. Dryad Arbor is a forest. It's actually a creature forest, or a forest creature, I forget which. Eric Levine could let me know. We have Leech-ridden swamp, etc., etc. There is also one other typed land that isn't in this category because it's a multicolor producing land. So we have the fast duels, we have the buddy lands, that's the M10 and the Innistrad duels, and that's where you actually get this untapped in 10 cards percentage. And this basically involves, Clifftop Retreat, for example, it needs to have a mountain or a plains there to come in untapped. And so we're running the math on that, and it's math that accounts for, obviously basic mountains and plains. It accounts for things like Sacred Foundry, which is a mountain plains, or Stomping Ground, which is a mountain forest. And it accounts for things like the fact that a Misty Rainforest can crack and go get that Stomping Ground, which in turn can bring your Clifftop Retreat in untapped. Which honestly is what a lot of that faded out math on the right side is engineering, is the ability to run those calculations. Continuing on down, we have the pain lands, which are sort of falling out of favor these days because there are just better options. I put City of Brass in here as a pain land also. Quick note, you'll notice that the top stuff here is locked in place. That's just for convenience because the spreadsheet is so long. Then we have other multicolored lands. So we have, everyone's favorite engine component, Grove of the Burnwillows, Horizon Canopy, Murmuring Bosque. And so here, Murmuring Bosque, again, is a forest. Nimbus Maze, River of Tears. Quick note about River. I counted River as an Enter the Battlefield tap land because you have to work around the inconvenience of its sort of now I make black, now I make blue features. If in the context of your deck you don't think that's the case, you can always just uncheck that and it will change the calculations. And that's one of the advantages here. You can toggle things a little bit if you think I'm not properly accounting for the traits of the land. Or if you just like to mess with your calculations. Going on down, we have the filter lands. One feature that I don't have in the worksheet yet is accounting for the color needs of the filter lands. A fetid heath, you got to have a white or black producer for it to be useful, right? That can be accounted for. I just basically didn't want to have this week's column be any later, have the worksheet be any later by engineering that in also. I plan on getting to it in the near-ish future. Then we have fetches. And you notice the fetches have no intrinsic color production, but you'll notice as you put things into the spreadsheet, colors will actually appear here because we actually collect what colors that each fetch gives you access to. Then creature lands, various stripes, and the last category, what I called frequent utility lands, just things that I thought would turn up enough that I wanted them built into the spreadsheet. So we have Academy Ruins, Ghost Quarter, Tech Edge, then additional lands. And so here is where you can enter whatever you want. Maybe you're running Deckmore Salvage for some reason. So you could type it in there and put in the number and note trace like the fact that it enters the battlefield tap. And I'll show myself doing this in just a little bit. And then down at the bottom, there's this area, I think, of about 20 slots where you can add stuff in. Then we have stats, and right now you notice everything is empty or errored. But it's going to give you the kind of things that you're expecting from the worksheet, and I'll show you the full details of what you get out of it when we do a worked example, which we'll do in the next video.